And at number 10, organic webs. Tobey Maguire's iteration of Spider-Man was extremely accurate to the comic source material, but one of the few differences between the two was his version of Spider-Man's web shooters. For most of Spider-Man's nearly 60 years of existence in comic books and various adaptations, the superhero used a pair of wrist-mounted shooters that shoot a synthetic web-like fluid. While most Spider-Man adaptations retain the iconic mechanical web shooters, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy opted to give its version of Peter Parker the power to generate webbing from his body. When you really think about it, it is really gross. It was even a joke made in the latest Spider-Man movie when the Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland versions of the characters are flabbergasted and slightly grossed out by Tobey Maguire's organic sticky spider webbing that came propelling out of this weird scar on his wrist. Maybe I'm weird, but I kinda like the organic webbing? I don't know, maybe because I grew up on the Raimi films, it felt right, and the reason for Raimi doing it makes sense to me. I'm sorry.
Number 9, from rags to riches and back to rags again. One of the weirdest things that happened to Peter in regards to no one seemingly really acknowledging or remembering it much in the continuity is when Peter became basically a globe-trotting billionaire all his own, in a similar but distinctly different style to Iron Man's Tony Stark. Well, of course, initially it was Otto and Peter's body who created Parker Industries and made it a success, but still, even without Otto in the driver's seat, it makes sense when you think about it, as Peter is a brilliant man who, if he had the time and he put in the effort, could easily end up near the top of the Fortune 500. However, what is weird is that he created a global company that was extremely profitable and successful for a time, lost it, and then everyone seemingly forgot who he was. He ended up back as just poor Peter Parker, just trying to get by while playing the role of hero. And everyday folks don't seem to even recognize him as the face of a once great global company. That's pretty nuts.
Number 8. Getting beat up by the Spot. Jonathan Owen is a villain that only well-versed fans of Spider-Man would recognize, probably. As the Spot, Jonathan hasn't always been the most relevant villain of Peter Parker. He often ends up on the list of Spider-Man's worst and unknown villains. I mean, when he first confronted Spider-Man and announced his villain moniker in Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man Volume 1, Issue 99 in 1985, the hero hit the ground laughing, which made it all the more embarrassing for Spider-Man when the Spot actually defeated him. Spot threw Peter in and out of his dimensions using his whole portals. He landed more than a few good punches on the hero as well. The Spot doesn't hit hard, but as he says, even the strongest of trees can be felled by sufficient strokes from even the smallest of hatchets. Yeah, he said that. Eventually he left Peter discombobulated, with Black Cat having to help him back to his feet, and he got his own back eventually, but that's not important.
Coming in at number 7, we have the time Spider-Man had to take on the entire Sinister Six at once in the PlayStation 4's Spider-Man video game. After a breakout at the supervillain prison The Raft, Peter is faced with his worst nightmare when he's surrounded by the combined team of the RHINO, the Vulture, Scorpion, Electro, and Mr. Negative, who are more than enough to weaken Spider-Man before the arrival of the leader of the Sinister Six, Dr. Octopus, who up until this point had been a friend and mentor to this universe's Peter Parker. The betrayal cuts Peter deep, and his wounded body is thrown into New York Harbor, only barely surviving by holding on to a floating oil drum. This beatdown was so bad, Peter eventually needed a specialized costume to be strong enough to go up against Doc Ock once more.
Number 6. Spider-Man and Silk getting busy on the ceiling. Cindy Moon, first revealed in The Amazing Spider-Man #1 from 2014, was a girl who on the same day was also bitten by the exact same spider that gave Peter Parker his powers. Now fast forward to the 4th issue of that comic, and Peter learns of her existence and the place she was being kept safe. He releases her and joins her as she goes off into the world. Now it took about 5 or 6 pages before it was revealed that these two young spider heroes release pheromones that make them irresistibly attracted to one another, and they nearly immediately start going at it. Mid-argument. They go at it so much so that it carries on into the next issue when he and Cindy Moon are on the ceiling of the apartment that Peter shares with his roommate Anna Maria Marconi. So of course Anna Maria walks in on the two spider freaks sparsely clothed and unable to control themselves. not an ideal situation.
Number 5. The Wrath of the SRA. Spider-Man not only impressively survived unmasking for his pal Tony Stark during the events of Civil War, but he also managed to survive betraying Tony as well. When Spider-Man got a good look at the camp Stark's side of the war were running, he realized that he had made the wrong choice, and attempted to walk out. Iron Man, however, isn't ready to let Peter go, and attempts to stop him. He tries to tell S.H.I.E.L.D. to just bring Spider-Man in quietly, as all Tony wants to do is talk to him. He doesn't want to fight, but S.H.I.E.L.D., under the Superhuman Registration Act, denies Stark's request, and attempts to have Spider-Man apprehended and arrested, sending the top secret Thunderbolts team that they have amassed after Spider-Man. They send Jack-O-Lantern and Jester III, and if it weren't for the interference of Punisher, he may have ended up dead at their hands. Well, S.H.I.E.L.D. was ready to rein in their team members when it came to how much force they were using, but still, they already kind of almost killed Spider-Man at that point, putting him in critical condition by the time Punisher showed up to save him. You could see the fight and the shape that Peter is in by the end of it in issue number 5 of the first Civil War series.
Number 4. Miles getting Gwen's hair stuck on his hand. If you haven't seen the totally awesome and award-winning animated Into the Spider-Verse film, well, pause this video and go do that and then come back. But if you have, then you surely remember the scene not too long after Miles Morales discovers he has powers and winds up in an extremely embarrassing situation with Gwen Stacy, his crush. You see, Miles' uncle told him to try this totally slick move on his crush where he puts his hand on her shoulder and be like, "Hey." Which, I don't know where you go after you say the "hey" thing. It kind of feels like terrible advice, and I think it was because Miles just did it in the middle of a conversation and made it really bad. But then, thanks to his new powers, when he goes to remove his hand, he accidentally gets stuck to her hair. The next 30 seconds sees him accidentally pull her in close, get stuck to her textbook, spin around, blame it on puberty, and then get catapulted by her, all in front of other students. She ends up getting half her hair buzzed off, which, hey, it's an experience neither of them will forget. Maybe when they're married they'll laugh about it, I don't know, maybe not.
Coming in at number 3, we have the time that Deadpool accidentally killed and then resurrected Spider-Man twice. After a complicated series of events led to Deadpool being hired to kill his friend Spider-Man and being convinced that Peter had turned to evil, the Merc with a Mouth shot Peter Parker in the head unexpectedly at his apartment. This would be a pretty anticlimactic end to the spectacular Spider-Man, however, and Deadpool eventually convinced his demon girlfriend of the time to resurrect his buddy, because comic books are weird like that. In a comedic twist, Deadpool would shoot Peter again after briefly thinking that he had once more turned to evil, but eventually everyone wound up alive and safe, even if this would continue to be one of the weirdest situations in Spider-Man's very weird history.
Number 2. Spiderweb underwear. In The Amazing Spider-Man from 2014, after Spider-Man had a bit of a body swap with a certain villain, he got into a fight that had all of his costume, minus his mask, zapped off. Like, all of it, down to his birthday suit. As a quick solution to the problem, Spider-Man decided to use his webbing to cover up his privates as an honestly genius decision. Well, it would have been genius, but see, Peter didn't realize that the villain he mind swapped with actually improved his webbing so it now lasts much longer, which meant Peter now had some permanent underwear for a while. So not only did Spider-Man have a costume consisting of a mask and web undies that was seen all over live television, prompting many characters to laugh at him, and even gave Jessica Drew a clue that this was Peter Parker back in his body again, he also had to explain this whole thing in one long monologue to Captain America of all people. Oh, Peter, you never cease to amaze.
Number 1. Trapped in Dr. Octopus's mind. At one point in the comics, we get the awesome weirdness that is Superior Spider-Man, which is basically when Otto Octavius, aka Dr. Octopus, takes hold of Spider-Man's body. However, this happens as the result of a body swap, which Peter is tricked into, which means that Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, has his consciousness end up in the failing body of Otto Octavius, who at that time was dying. While trapped in Otto's mind, Peter ends up reliving some of Otto's memories, namely an extremely intimate and weirdly romantic moment that happened between Otto and Aunt May when the two were engaged to be married. Although they never ended up married, apparently they still sealed the deal, if you know what I mean. Which means that Peter got a front row seat to an intimate interaction that he'd rather have never known happened. And you know, he's in Otto's body in that memory, so. Number 10. Unmasking. During the events of Civil War, Spider-Man ultimately decided to side with Iron Man, and to prove how loyal he was to the cause, he even decided to publicly unmask, to show just how much he believed in his friend Tony Stark and the idea of the Superhuman Registration Act. However, this turned out to be the wrong choice for Peter in the end. Not only was his life at risk as a result of his choice, and as a result of ultimately changing his mind, but also the lives of those he loved were threatened as well. Peter Parker almost ended up being shot to death at the behest of Kingpin, who put a hit out on him, and as a result of surviving that, being nearly missed, Aunt May instead ended up taking a bullet and almost lost her life, being put into intensive care. Peter Parker would also end up losing his marriage after he and Mary Jane made a deal with Mephisto in order to save Aunt May's life. So really, it's pretty impressive that Peter managed to survive this whole overall fairly awful ordeal, both when it comes to keeping his life and keeping his sanity. Number 9. Witnessing Aunt May's romance. During a time where Peter swapped bodies with Dr. Octopus, he found himself trapped in his body and in Dr. Ock's mind. Because of this, Peter ended up forced to watch a memory that Otto had of a night of passion with Peter's own Aunt May before their almost wedding at the time. Sure, Peter has survived a lot of physical beatings and extremely devastating disasters, but the emotional trauma of this one, I do not know how he did it. Peter obviously did not want to see this, and yet he was forced to. And still afterward, he manages to be able to look both Otto and Aunt May in the eye when he needs to. I do not know how though. Not only did Peter survive this, by the way, but also survived witnessing all the beatings from Otto's perspective that he, as Spider-Man, had given him via Otto's memories. That is some mental and emotional durability right there. Although I guess this version of Peter kind of died, as he only managed to survive via his subconscious after this. Here's hoping he managed to forget this at least, somehow. Maybe because only his subconscious kind of survived, his consciousness of this is like, boop, gone. I hope so. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to learn about some more crazy things that Spider-Man has survived, there's lots out there, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 8. Electrocuted and thrown from a skyscraper. During the events of Marvel Knight's Spider-Man, as early as the 3rd issue in, Spider-Man gets badly beaten and ends up in such a bad way that he is rushed to the ER. This all happens after Aunt May has seemingly been kidnapped. In this much darker take on Spider-Man's world, as written by Mark Miller, Spider-Man confronts Electro and the Vulture, suspecting they may have been involved. During this fight, Spider-Man gets badly electrocuted more than once by Electro. In fact, at one point he is so severely and dramatically electrocuted that he ends up being flinged from a skyscraper and plummets to the ground, before he can recover enough to even shoot a web and swing to safety. Instead, he smashes all the way down and through a cab, knocked unconscious and badly injured. The paramedics then rush him to the hospital. That is how severely Electro injured him. Of course, this is Spider-Man, and somehow, miraculously, he manages to survive, but whew, it was definitely a close call. Number 7. Everyone loves MJ. An awkward moment in the Ultimate Spider-Man universe comes courtesy of Ultimate Peter Parker getting his own version of the Clone Saga. Except here, instead of Ben Reilly and Kane Parker, we got Kane Parker and Jessica Drew. That's right, in the Ultimate universe, Jessica Drew is actually a female clone of Peter Parker. There were some other clones too, just for those of you that are like, you didn't mention all the other clones. But yes, I know about them. They exist. And even more intriguing and also kind of sad in this reality, Jessica and all the other clones have all of Peter's memories, which leads to pretty much all of them having a huge crush on MJ. Jessica included. Although in an even stranger twist, despite also being in love with Mary Jane, or seemingly being in love with Mary Jane, instead of Jessica ending up as a lesbian in this portrayal of her character as a result of sharing Peter's memories and feelings, it is implied that she actually ends up dating Johnny Storm, albeit possibly briefly. Although I think that also could say something about the potential for the close relationship that Johnny and Peter have in the comics, so maybe that's what that's about. Number 6. missile explosion. During issues 523 and 524 of The Amazing Spider-Man, we learned that Spider-Man managed to survive the explosion of a massive missile that was filled with toxins. Not only did we see Peter survive the explosion, but he also survived the fallout after being saved by Iron Man. Stark secured Peter and took him back to the Avengers Mansion as quickly as possible so that he could treat him for the toxins he had been exposed to and his injuries. Fortunately, Peter is so durable, with such a tough immune system apparently, that he was able to fight off most of the effects until Stark managed to treat him. And in so doing, Stark saved his life. It's pretty convenient. He also happened to arrive at just the right time, as Peter was also about to fall at terminal velocity into the ocean, the impact of which could have killed him. Quite lucky that he's so tough and that Iron Man arrived in the nick of time. That all worked out pretty well.
Coming in at number 5, we have the time Peter Parker became a literal spider monster. We've already covered a storyline on this list where Peter grew some extra limbs, but during an event in which the concept of the spider totems was first introduced into the Marvel mythology, Peter Parker found himself transformed into a gigantic spider-human hybrid, with horrifying mandibles and a hunger for human flesh. Eventually, this creature would appear to die and then be reborn as a fresh Peter Parker, now possessing organic web shooters. While this may have just been a really convoluted storyline to make Spidey's web status the same as the Tobey Maguire movies, it's still a body horror storyline that makes my skin crawl.
Number 4. Beat Down by MORLUN. During the story The Other, Peter seemed to be suffering from and ultimately dying of a mysterious illness. While struggling with this, MORLUN decided to pay Spider-Man a visit just to basically torment him. Focused on his potential impending death, Spider-Man is caught unawares when MORLUN attacks him while he's swinging around the city attempting to clear his mind. The two have an insanely explosive fight, but just as Peter thinks he has the upper hand, MORLUN brutally defeats him. He plucks out Spider-Man's eye and eats it, and then beats him to within an inch of his life. Spider-Man manages to survive this attack despite him losing an eye and being beaten to a pulp by MORLUN. Number 3. Spider-Man loses control. One of the most awkward moments in terms of just what went down has to be when Spider-Man accidentally hits MJ when she's trying to get between Peter and his clone Ben Reilly to stop them from fighting one another. Oddly enough, I was remembering a thing where this also appeared. Even though this moment was very different in terms of what caused it to happen, a very similar incident also is incorporated into the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man film franchise. In this case, MJ tries to stop Peter from beating up on a bouncer at the nightclub that she works at. In the comics, Peter and Ben both go to run some tests to figure out who is the clone and who is the original between them, when Peter learns that Ben is supposedly the original, and he freaks out. He begins wailing on Ben, and Mary Jane breaks free to attempt to break up the fight, calling out to her husband, "Stop it, Peter, for the love of God! Stop, you're killing him!" Instinctively, Peter goes to push MJ back, telling her to get away and leave him alone, and he strikes her, sending her flying with his super strength, only for him to realize what he's done almost immediately, condemning his own behavior before running away. In Spider-Man 3, it goes down similarly, with Peter running away even following this encounter, and MJ calling out, "Peter, stop it," which is also very similar. Number 2. Body failure. Another time that Peter Parker died, it was actually as Dr. Otto Octavius. During the time of Superior Spider-Man, Otto got a hold of Peter's body by tricking him into a body swap. With Peter's consciousness stuck in Otto's old failing body, when it died, so seemingly did Spider-Man. I mean, we still had Peter's body, but for now, Otto was the one behind the steering wheel. Fortunately, while Peter did kind of die, he also managed to survive, as Otto was unable to wipe Peter's complete consciousness clean from his own body, and his subconscious kinda lingered there. In the end, Otto gave up his own hold over Spider-Man's body in order to let Peter Parker reclaim his body and his mantle once more. Otto was compelled to do this when he realized that even with all that he had done, he could never truly be a better Spider-Man than Peter, because he was kind of missing the moral compass, which was part of what truly made Peter Parker superior. Also, he needed Peter's help, because he was like, "I'm trying to save the woman I love and it's like impossible, please. I need the real Spider-Man, help." Number 1. Annihilation of his universe. Miles Morales didn't just survive the death or a bad beatdown, but actually managed to survive the destruction of his entire universe. Following the events of Secret Wars and the creation and dissolution of Emperor Doom's Battleworld, Miles Morales somehow managed to survive after his entire reality of Earth 1610 was pretty much completely destroyed. How? Well, Miles Morales' Spider-Man managed to earn a new life for his family and himself on the reinstated reality of Earth 616, all because of an act of kindness in combination with a weird quirk. Molecule Man had been asking for a snack, and Miles happened to have a burger in the pocket of his suit, which he gave him. As a result, Molecule Man decided to make sure when the universe was recreated using his powers that Miles and his family had a place in it. How nice. He also gave Miles' uncle Aaron Davis a new lease on life in the Earth 616 reality as well. Pretty sure he also brought his mom back to life too. Earth 1610 has returned since its destruction, and one of its other survivors, the Maker, even managed to return to it, but at the time it wasn't around. So, still pretty cool that Miles survived that.
Coming in at number 10, we have the time Peter grew and then lost 4 additional arms, literally making him an 8-limbed freak. This event took place during a period of time in which being Spider-Man had brought Peter nothing but pain, with Gwen Stacy's father having recently passed away, and Gwen believing Spider-Man to be responsible. Thus, Peter decided to get rid of his double life by developing a serum to remove his spider abilities. Unfortunately, testing serums on yourself rarely works out in the Marvel Universe, and Peter's spider powers are amplified to the point that 4 additional arms burst forth out of his body. And while Spider-Man would eventually be able to balance out his life and lose the additional limbs, it's still a bizarre tale of body horror that Peter is lucky to have gotten out of unscathed. Coming in at number 9, we have getting trampled by the RHINO in the video game Spider-Man Miles Morales. This game is one of my favorites of the last couple years, and it opens with both Peter Parker and Miles Morales working together as Spider-Men to try and transport the RHINO safely to the supervillain prison. Unfortunately, the RHINO breaks free, and the opening tutorial of the game is trying to chase the villain down and stop his rampage. Unfortunately, since this is just the tutorial, Peter Parker does most of the fighting and winds up getting his butt kicked, getting hit with attacks that should definitely have shattered at least half the bones in his body. Luckily, Miles is eventually able to save the day by discovering his Venom Blast ability, but it's still a wonder how Spidey is able to even stand after all of that pummeling. Coming in at number 8, we have Firebrand burning Peter Parker alive. During another period where Spider-Man was a bit off his game, he got into a fight with the usually low-level villain Firebrand. Unfortunately, Spider-Man's taunts during the fight pushed Firebrand over the edge, causing him to fully unleash his power and blow up a city block. The resulting explosion was shown in graphic detail to burn both Peter's costume and his flesh, and the only reason he was able to survive without permanent scarring was due to the quick intervention of a hospital that usually only treats supervillains. I guess one perk of getting most of your face burnt off is that the doctors won't know exactly who they're healing. Nicely handled, Spider-Man.
Number 7, Sinister War. Sinister War also really scrambled Spider-Man up. I mean, what's worse than one team of 6 sinister villains? How about a whole bunch of Sinister 6 teams? Which is exactly the trial that Peter faced during Sinister War. Pretty much all of the villains he came up against seemed to also want Spider-Man for one reason or another. And while some fought to actually protect Spidey, many more were fighting to harm, capture, or perhaps even kill him. Needless to say, it was one long night for Spider-Man, with him dealing with fight after fight to the point that he couldn't even catch his breath.
Coming in at number 6, we have the time that Spider-Man was tortured by the dark ancient sorcerer KULAN. During a comic event that saw the entire city of Manhattan transformed into an alternate medieval fantasy version, Spider-Man was one of the few heroes who remembered the world as it truly was. As punishment for rebelling against KULAN Goth's rule, this version of Spider-Man was tortured and put on display for all of KULAN Goth's enemies to see. And while Spider-Man would eventually be restored once KULAN Goth was defeated and reality reverted back to normal, it's still incredibly disturbing to see one of Marvel's greatest heroes being put in such a violent situation.
Number 5. Aunt May forgets to knock. Speaking on people walking in on people. Later on in their comic book history, MJ and Peter wouldn't just be friends or even dating, they would actually end up married for quite a long while. However, just because they were married didn't mean that Aunt May always remembered to respect their privacy and knock when they were alone together in a bedroom. Case in point in Web of Spider-Man issue number 50, when she decides to bring them up some warm hot cocoa to warm their bones on a cold winter's night, only to find out that they are already busy warming their bones.
Coming in at number 4, we have the time that Spider-Man lifted an entire building and lived to tell the tale. In one of the most iconic, defining moments for the entire character, Spider-Man found himself trapped under the rubble of a collapsed building, with water rapidly filling the area as well. In order to save the life of his Aunt May, Peter had to lift the weight of the entire building off of his back. This is the pivotal moment where Spider-Man showed just how strong he could be when the situation called for it, and just how far he was willing to push his body to save the lives of the people he loves. Something that would go on to become a defining feature of the character. But seriously, Peter, you should probably get someone to spot you the next time you lift something that heavy.
Number 3. Killed by KRAVEN. In reality, KRAVEN never really killed Peter, although we were meant to believe that he had killed Spider-Man. I mean, it definitely looked like he'd killed Spider-Man. KRAVEN at one point sets out in KRAVEN's last hunt to beat Spider-Man by replacing him and proving that he is better than Spider-Man is. However, in the end, he begins to question if he's truly beaten Spider-Man, and who actually makes a better Spider. He realizes that there is no one quite like Peter Parker when it comes to being Spider-Man, just as Spider-Man himself seemingly returns from the dead. In truth, KRAVEN had merely administered a drug that had made Peter seem dead, probably slowing his heart rate, definitely making him trip out, and putting him in a stasis for a few weeks. Spider-Man, however, was buried alive by KRAVEN and wakes up in his grave. Pretty sure he was also shot point blank by KRAVEN, but anyways. Spider-Man then has to dig his way out and find his way back to the villain for that final confrontation. The story ends with KRAVEN taking his own life, believing he had finally accomplished everything in his life that he had set out to do. But don't worry, KRAVEN would come back, because KRAVEN.
Coming in at number 2, we have the so-called death of the Ultimate Spider-Man. In the comic book event that would lead to the debut of Miles Morales, the Peter Parker of the Ultimate Marvel Universe had to die before a new Spider-Man could rise. In a final battle against his nemesis, the Green Goblin, the teenage Peter Parker protected his family against Norman Osborn's relentless and crazed attacks, even after he'd already been mortally wounded by an assassin's bullet. While at the time this seemed like a tragic and dramatic end to the Ultimate Peter Parker, it would eventually be revealed that he actually survived this intense battle, as the Oz formula that gave him his spider abilities also functionally made this Peter Parker immortal. Maybe it's just a weird comic book retcon, but the fact that Peter survived so many injuries is truly mind-blowing, and I can't wait to see where the Ultimate Universe takes us next. And finally, coming in at our top spot, we have Spider-Man's head-crushing defeat in the original Infinity Gauntlet event. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we may have all gotten our hearts broken by that classic, "I don't want to go, Mr. Stark," but the battle for the Infinity Gauntlet in the comics may have been even more brutal to Peter Parker than we'd ever want to see on the big screen. In the comics, Peter is able to briefly get the upper hand on Thanos with some web attacks to the face, but is then viciously beaten by Thanos' lady companion, Terraxia, who is shown to kill the wall crawler by attacking him with a rock. Pretty brutal for a Cosmic Marvel event. And while by the end of Infinity Gauntlet all of the killed heroes would be restored, this might just be one of the most bone-crushing losses ever suffered by Spider-Man.